support Congress's bipartisan effort to strengthen and modernize the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, review process and its inclusion in the National Defense Authorization Act. The administration is pleased to work with members to maintain our open investment environment while ensuring that certain transactions are reviewed for national security purposes. We have made great progress in the last 18 months in implementing the President's agenda. We are working every day to guide multilateral financial organizations towards a limited role that is more consistent with free markets, faster growth, and U.S. national interests. Hardworking taxpayers across the country are optimistic that they will have a more prosperous and secure future, and we are seeing America's great potential come to fruition. Thank you very much. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I will now yield to myself for questioning. Clearly, as you heard from my opening remarks, I am most concerned about the status of global trade, and I realize that most of this was within the bailiwick of USTR and Commerce, but clearly America's trade policies do have an impact on the international finance system. So again, as I said, I've been heartened by comments by the President and by Secretary Ross that our goal appears to be to eliminate or at least significantly reduce trade barriers. But I am concerned because in the one trade agreement that has been modified since the administration began its policy, Korea, what I think I saw in the Korean agreement is the imposition of a quota on Korean steel exports to the U.S., and a 20-year extension of a 25% tariff on Korean trucks. So I would hope that the answer and the goal would be for America to export more, not necessarily import less. And so the question, Mr. Secretary, is Korea the template for future modifications of our bilateral or multilateral trade agreements?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And I have had the opportunity to work very closely with Ambassador Lighthizer and Secretary Ross and others in the administration with the President. The President is very focused on free and fair trade. As you mentioned, at the G7, the President specifically said, let's sign a free trade agreement with no tariffs, no barriers, no subsidies. So the President is very much focused, fighting every day on having free and fair trade. In regards to your question, there's no specific model for other agreements. We are very focused on NAFTA and renegotiating that.
Well, I would just say again, Mr. Secretary, I appreciate the words, but I am concerned about the deeds as I look at the Korean, how the Korean trade agreement has been modified. Mr. Secretary, I also want to speak again. I could not say it more clearly that many Americans are seeing an economic miracle, and it's because of the President and, frankly, the work you have done and others on tax cut, the increased jobs, right-sizing regulation. But I think the greatest economic stimulus I've seen is business optimism. And unfortunately, my fear is that may be receding. I'm not sure if you're familiar. CNBC does a survey of CFOs of major U.S. Companies, and 65% have reported that they fear U.S. trade policy will negatively impact their firms over the next 6 months. It's been reported as of July 6th that the FOMC's minutes of June meeting had this in it, quote, most FOMC participants noted that uncertainty and risk associated with trade policy had intensified and were concerned that such uncertainty and risk eventually could have negative effects on business sentiment and investment spending. So I'm just curious, Mr. Secretary, how does the administration think about business uncertainty as it calculates its trade policy?
Mr. Chairman, I can assure you that the President is very much focused on economic growth, and I can also assure you that I am monitoring the situation very carefully. I'm not familiar with that specific poll, but I speak on a regular basis to many industries as well as people within the administration, and we are monitoring the economic situation. We have not yet seen any negative impact, although, as you've said, we are monitoring carefully the impact on uncertainty on investments.
Well, again, as you know, Mr. Secretary, even as of today, the actual tariffs are a small part of our global trade, but that is soon to change if the $200 billion that has now been threatened against China actually comes to be in 60 days. I guess the last question I would have, Mr. Secretary, is I'm curious how the administration thinks about the possibility of a global recession. I mean, in the U.S., as you know, we're facing rising interest rates. The Fed needs to have an orderly wind down of its balance sheet. You know better than others that we may be looking at an inverted yield curve that, at least historically, has been a leading indicator of a recession. We know about tightening monetary policy in other segments. So there's already a threat to economic growth. How do you factor that in, again, to the administration's trade policy? What is the risk?
Mr. Chairman, let me just comment specifically on the, we don't have an inverted yield curve. There is a flattening of the yield curve. That somewhat reflects people's future view of rates and where rates will be. I don't think that's indicative of any way of recessionary concerns. And as I said, we are monitoring very carefully the impact of tariffs, and we will continue to do so. And we are very focused on economic growth and look forward to what hopefully will be a very big quarter of GDP and future growth for the balance of the year and next year.
The time has expired. I now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Because of this president's trade war, again, Mid-Continental Nail that I mentioned in my opening statement, America's largest nail manufacturer based in Missouri, laid off 60 workers last week and expects to go out of business by Labor Day. Harley-Davidson, this company is as American as motherhood and apple pie. Based in Wisconsin, is moving jobs overseas to Europe to avoid tariffs on its exports. Volvo, again, will no longer hire 4,000 new workers in South Carolina, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce warns that 2.6 million jobs are on the chopping block because of Trump's policy on tariffs. On top of all the job loss, American families will pay higher prices for the goods that they buy since tariffs are a tax paid by Americans. And it seems things are only going to get worse. Just yesterday, Trump announced that he may levy an additional $200 billion in tariffs on China. China responded that it would take further retaliatory measures, possibly including more tariffs on U.S. goods, letting its currency depreciate, or even selling off billions of Treasury bonds. The Trump administration appears to be flying by the seat of its pants with no plan for how to address the possibility of a recession, the higher prices consumers will pay, and the resulting losses of millions of American jobs. Further, reports indicate that while the Federal Reserve is concerned about the possibility of a recession resulting from a trade war, it does not have the tools necessary to combat such a self-inflicted disaster. As each day brings another announcement of jobs being eliminated or shipped overseas and consumers paying more for goods, what are you doing as Treasury Secretary to prevent further harm to our economy from the growing trade war? I know that you've attempted to answer this when the chairman, questioned you about it, but I want to hear more in depth about how you're thinking about this and what you plan to do if there is further harm to our economy.
Thank you very much. First of all, I've noted the nail company, and I will reach out to the Secretary of Commerce to see if that company is subject to some type of exemption, because obviously we don't want companies losing jobs. As it relates to Harley-Davidson, I've previously publicly commented on this. I think the President has been a huge advocate of Harley-Davidson. I think it's unfortunate that they're talking about moving jobs. My sense is that this was before tariffs. I will comment specifically on China because I personally have been very involved in China. I've had multiple negotiations with them. Our objective is to create a level playing field for our companies to stop forced technology transfer. We put a modest amount of tariffs on China as a result of technology transfers. China reciprocated. Our tariffs were less than 10% of what they shipped. They matched that dollar for dollar, and the president threatened if they did that he would retaliate, and we're now in a comment period on the $200 billion. And again, I would just assure you, we very much are monitoring the impact on the economy of all these different issues.
I want to thank you for that, but I want to get back to Harley-Davidson because this is something that the American public really understands. They understand very, very much that Harley-Davidson is a company that we would not like to see export overseas. So you kind of mumble that the tariffs had nothing to do with them moving, exporting jobs overseas. What did you just say?
So first of all, let me apologize if I mumbled. I'll try to be clearer. First of all, in all fairness, I have not spoken to the Harley-Davidson people direct. I know that the president has spoken to them. I can tell you, as I've sat in meetings with the president, other leaders, he always talked about tariffs on motorcycles and cutting tariffs on motorcycles. My sense is that Harley-Davidson had previously planned on moving some of this manufacturing, and it's not just a result. But in all fairness, I have not spoken to them direct. But I share your concern very much of any jobs being moved by Harley-Davidson or other people as a result of tariffs.
What will you do to try and get them not to move the jobs overseas?
I am going to specifically reach out to them and find out the details with the Secretary of Commerce.
And are you saying the president's tariffs have nothing to do with them moving those jobs overseas?
I have not spoken to them direct, so
Have you spoken to the president?
Yes, I have.
And what did he say?
Again, the president has been a huge advocate of Harley-Davidson and is very disappointed on Harley-Davidson's.
Did he ask them to stay?
Yes, he did.
And they turned him down?
No, they asked them afterwards, and I don't know the status of those.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, chairman of our Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee.
Mr. Secretary, I certainly support the administration's objectives to promote fair and reciprocal trade, but since we're on the topic, I'll stick with the topic for a little while. I do appreciate your testimony that you and the administration continue to monitor the impact of tariffs, but I do have concerns that tariffs and retaliatory measures on American industries could very well suppress or even reverse the record level of growth and job creation we've seen under your leadership and the president's leadership and the booming economy. As we've discussed, my home state of Kentucky's signature bourbon and distilled spirits industry accounted for more than $450 million in exports worldwide in 2017. Of that, nearly $200 million was exported to EU countries, where the market for bourbon has been growing at record levels in recent years. An extended trade war would not only harm that iconic industry, but also Kentucky's farm families, suppliers, tourism, and ultimately consumers through higher prices and limited availability. Similarly, our companies and workers in the auto industry are facing steep international competition for jobs, sales, and innovation that has been intensified by the ongoing tariffs. Toyota's 30-year-old plant in my district in Georgetown, Kentucky, is Toyota's largest manufacturing plant globally.